Long before Hollywood's sexual harassment scandal, Americans were riveted to televised testimony about sexual harassment, the Senate nomination hearings of then Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. In the spotlight, young African-American lawyer Anita Hill, fighting to be believed.
My working relationship became even more strained when Judge Thomas began to use work situations to discuss sex. After a brief discussion of work, he would turn the conversation to a discussion of sexual matters. His conversations were very vivid. He talked about pornographic materials depicting individuals with large penises or large breasts involved in various sex acts. On several occasions, Thomas told me graphically of his own sexual prowess.
The recent stories of sexual harassment in the workplace are toppling the careers of power brokers in entertainment, business, sports, and media. But few of the accusers who've come forward are women of color.
We would really want everyone to know that for every Weinstein out there, there's 100 more men in our communities who are doing the exact same thing. These things happen to us in the military, it happens to our children, it happens to us in the workforce. It happens to our immigrant community, our immigrant brothers and sisters.
Tonight, a look at sexual harassment in communities of color. What happens when we say, "Me too"? Welcome to our 50th season of Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our live broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook Live. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Joining me tonight are Issa Woldeguiorguis, Executive Director of the Center for Hope and Healing in Lowell, Massachusetts; Carla Reeves, an employment attorney with Goulston and Storrs; Dr. Cherita Cloy, a crisis intervention counselor at Boston University; and Duane de Four, a senior prevention specialist at MIT. In addition to his private consulting firm, de Four is also a member of the Governor's Council to address sexual assault and domestic violence. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
I think I just want to put on the table that when we talk about sexual harassment, sexual violence, there's a range. Can be inappropriate touching, words, epithets, obviously rape. It covers all of that, teasing, that kind of thing. And I want to put it on the table because as these conversations have been heated up since these stories have come public, I've talked to a lot of men, Duane, who say, I didn't realize it was that widespread. I'm kind of surprised it's that widespread, but you're not.
No, I've been doing this work for decades now, and so I have an idea of how much this happens. But I think back to before I started doing this work, I would say I was pretty unaware myself. Men don't talk about it as much. It doesn't happen to men as much. So that's part of the reason why we don't talk about it as much. And so it's just when it happens, for a lot of men who are unaware, it's like, wow, I didn't realize that was such a thing. And nobody wants to believe that somebody could do something so, horrible and damaging, and so it's part of that, that shock of discovering that for people who are just really not thinking about it at all.
Or even at the other end of the spectrum of just unwanted, because it can range from that as well. I wonder, because the point we're making here is that when the voices that have come forward publicly, except for Lupita Luongo, as we saw, and we'll get to that in a second, there haven't been many women of color coming forward, and we know it happens to men too, or even for that matter, men of color. Again, one has come forward. We'll talk about that. So, Issa, I'm looking at you to what kind of response have you been getting at your own Center of Hope and Healing as these stories have come forth publicly?
I think people in their own communities are disclosing that this is happening and has been happening in our communities for a very long time. And there's a level of, I would say, kind of anger that the high-profile situations, the situations that make publicity or that make policy and laws are typically stars, wealthy, right? That people who are not people of color in our communities. So I think that's a challenge for folks to say, this has been happening to us for years, and why does no one care to the same degree that when it happens to others?
Now, one place where we've been exploring rising awareness, or hoping to, is on college campuses. And you're at Boston University, and we've been seeing, just in our own area, but it's across the country, that a lot of students have come forward, particularly with the support of what was the Obama administration's rules. Those have gone away now. In case people didn't know that, the new Secretary for Education, Betsy DeVos, has eliminated those rules that would have made it a little bit easier for people to report. So since this happened, what are you hearing? And is there any breakdown, any racial breakdown that you can assess?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think so. College students are very much a part of social media too, and so, you know, when #MeToo comes out, you know, students I think felt comfortable to participate, but not all of them. So we see survivors where I work at the Sexual Assault Response and Prevention Center, and some felt like it was sort of putting too much burden on the survivors to be the ones to sort of make people aware of what's happening, as opposed to just sort of being aware sort of in general that this is happening everywhere and sort of putting the onus on the perpetrators of what's happening. I think in terms of sort of racial breakdown, I think similarly people do talk about this among people who look like them, people who share interest in the same interests that they have, and so they're talking about it amongst each other. We know that people report more to their friends than they do to confidential sources like ours. So I think they're talking about it amongst themselves. And the people who are already connected to us, they are sometimes triggered by a lot of what they see. And we encourage people to, you know, sort of take breaks from social media. So everybody who, even if you don't sort of post as #MeToo, it doesn't mean you're not a survivor. In fact, sometimes people don't feel comfortable at all sort of disclosing in any shape, form, or fashion.
So when something becomes as public as it has, as this scenario has with the Hollywood actresses and some of the other folks in other arenas, it doesn't make it necessarily easier for people to come forward.
Exactly.
They're just aware.
Exactly.
Okay.
No, I think that's right, and I think there's hope. There's like sort of it's helpful and harmful. It's helpful because it does make people more aware, but I think at the end of the day we have to always sort of center the survivor and try to make sure that we're always thinking about how can we help those individuals because they're the ones who are living it day in and day out. When we stop talking about it, when it's not being posted, and we're seeing them sort of, you know, when they come for clinical support with us.
So I imagine it takes a minute for any kind of legal case to rise to the occasion for women in workplaces who are saying, okay, I am now going to make this a formal complaint, which would reach attorneys like yourself. So is it too early to tell whether there's been an increase or some kind of shift in the cultural environment?
I think it's a bit early to tell whether or not there's been an increase in formal complaints that are coming through administrative agencies like the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. It takes a while for those cases to proceed, and at the administrative level, you're looking at about a year, and not all of those cases end up in court. But what I can say is that what I have seen in my practice is that employers are taking a look at their policies and are also reiterating the existing policies and making sure that employees are aware that the policies exist and that they are taken seriously in the workplace. And this is part of an effort that's ongoing at all times, but this focus in the media on what's been happening now has really emphasized the need to revisit those existing policies, make sure that trainings are still continuing to happen, and also just making sure that employers are taking the steps that they need to promptly and effectively address concerns as they're raised.
Yes.
Well, what tends to actually lead to more reports is not so much, you know, what we see in the media, but when services are made available, when policies are changed and people feel like, okay, there is a path for me to report, there is a path for me to seek help. You know, I can tell you at MIT, for example, the center that I work at, you know, at the beginning, we weren't getting as many reports, but as you know, we became more well-known on campus, did a lot more advertising, and just, you know, out there talking about the issue, people began to see, okay, this is the path to reporting these issues. Then every year the reports go up and up. So it's not so much about how much the conversation is occurring as it is people seeing that they can do something about it.
I'm just trying to figure out what the racial breakdown is. We know, for example, in cases of rape that 82% of juvenile rape victims are female. I want to, because you make the case too, there are men who are victims of this as well. but 90% of adult women, of rape victims, are women. So that's a high number across the board. My sense is, but I don't have any evidence of that, that when you break it down, black women, or certainly women of color, are in higher numbers than other communities. Can you speak to that?
I think the reason why it's difficult to look at the numbers is because I think what we know is black women tend not to report. And so since reporting across the board, regardless of demographic, it tends to be on the lower side, particularly to to the police in terms of like criminal side. And I would think for people of color, for women of color, we see in domestic violence situations, they don't want to necessarily invite the police into their space regardless, because they know how black men are being treated, particularly if it's sort of a black male perpetrator. And so they do want to be protective of, the perpetrator, even if it is somebody who's harming them. So I think it gets really, really complicated. And even sort of in the population that I see, I think you're aware that if the person who committed or is accused of committing the crime against you is a person of color, and they're sort of also in school and they're also trying to work hard. So it becomes even more complicated in terms of feeling like you are sort of going to do something
You're bringing them down.
Exactly.
Instead of protecting yourself.
That's right. Thank you. Yeah.
But the data does say that women of color, black women particularly, are at higher risk for domestic violence as well as sexual violence, and that means multiple things, right? It also means that our lives as women of color, also we live at the intersections. We're not just women of color, but there's extremely high rates of murder right now of trans women of color.
Right.
So and women of color who are also involved with the criminal justice system. So I feel like as women of color, the vulnerability or the risks for violence lie in the fact that we are at those intersections, right? And we are the ones who are more vulnerable. And you're right, don't often want to report for very good reasons, but that increases our vulnerability. So
Yeah, and these are crimes of power, right? Power and control.
Please say that again. People think it's sex and it's not. It's power.
Yeah, it's about having power over somebody, degrading somebody, all these things. And so if you are a member of a community that is more targeted, more disenfranchised, then you are more likely to be targeted for these sorts of things. So, that's what we see in the statistics. And that's across almost all crimes, really.
Absolutely. And I remember the Anita Hill day. I remember
watching
that people were lining up behind her like they lined up with Me Too and Alyssa Milano, and that, there was a lot more in my own community coming up. There's a lot more push and pull. No, that couldn't have happened. She must be making it up. This is a judge.
That's right.
Right? When people nowadays sort of said, Alyssa Milano, one tweet, and everyone was lining up behind it. That's a fascinating racial dynamic that we have to look at in this day and age.
Which brings me to the dynamic of, I mentioned at the beginning that there has been publicly one person of some note, Lupita Luongo, who's an actress who won an Oscar for her role in 12 Years a Slave, who's about to appear in the Black Panther films, and a host of other projects she's done quite successfully. She came forward and did her own personal testimony about what happened to her and Harvey Weinstein, which, as people will remember, that's the beginning of all of this, right? And wrote about it personally, very specific. He responded to her specifically, whereas 40 or some actresses have already accused him in graphic detail. One has accused him of a crime, really, of rape. His responses has been kind of a generic denial, but this was a specific go back at her. What was that about, do you think?
It suggested to me that he sees her as particularly vulnerable as compared to the other women who have stepped forward. For whatever reason, from my perspective, it seemed that perhaps she's someone whose credibility he could attack more easily.
And do you think he thought he could do that because she was a black woman as opposed to the other women? I mean, he was saying he didn't do it with any of these other women either, but specifically he called her out.
Right. I think that has a lot to do with it. There's a stronger statement that's been made in opposition to her decision to come forward, and she seems to have been treated differently from the rest of the group. And I do think it is very much so rooted in her race.
I think it's a reminder of the systems of oppression that we operate in. And so I think it's something like that. It's easy for other people to say, oh, no, it's not because of her race, but this is sort of the systems of oppression, whether it's about gender, race, her immigration status. I think she was actually in college when she met with him.
She was a student at Yale.
So she was already in a very vulnerable situation too, trying to rise into the field. And so I think when you start to look at that, I think we all just have to be really careful about changing equality and wanting us to all to be equal, so that sort of balances the power dynamics that are just out and about, regardless.
Yeah. And I just want to bring up Terry Crews, who is an African-American actor. He came out very early in support of the women whose voices we heard and said, I know it happens because it happened to me. He said he was groped by a high-ranking Hollywood executive. He did not name the person. Since then, that person has been named by others. He has not done it. And he is a very powerful agent at the William Morris Agency, and apparently known among others for this. But here we have a situation where, and Terry Crews describes the situation. He was at a party. Everybody's mingling.
Public,
His wife is standing there, and the guy just reached over and started groping him and laughed about it. So, this is very serious at every level.
And it's a reflective of, what we often see in that, it does happen to men, not at the same rate as it happens to women, but men, we often, we don't talk about it. And when these things happen, we don't see it as problematic. I mean, I've done so many trainings with groups of men, whether in fraternities or with athletics, and somebody will tell a story that is a story of an assault or harassment that they experienced, and they'll laugh it off, or their brothers or teammates will laugh it off and really minimize the situation, and so that makes it even less likely that men are going to report. And then the other thing is, the perpetrator in that case was a man. And, again, statistically, men are committing the majority of this violence against women and against other men. And that's another element that tends not to be talked about, right? So
I see with men, definitely, we're seeing an uptick in male callers, which is great, and men reaching out. But the dynamic you talked about earlier, where folks don't know the pathways or don't think that service is for me. When we pick up the phone, it's a man on the other end of the line. They're almost shocked that we're supporting them and believing them and sort of saying, right, we believe you and we're here for you too. They're like, really? So we need to change that cultural belief, right? That men, can't be victimized or shouldn't seek help or shouldn't disclose. So I'm glad to see that that's changing, actually.
Well, we started with the clip of Anita Hill, and I just wanted to demonstrate for people who don't realize how long this has been going on. That was 1991, but we went back in our archives to 1979. This is the 50th year of Basic Black. We went back in the archives and found a clip of where several women are discussing unwanted advances from men and their choice to say no. Let's take a look.
There has to be some sort of agreement that men will accept the fact that, yes, I can be assertive when I want to be assertive, when I don't want the situation to come up, but I can still be nurturing and pleasant and appealing when I want to be, to whom I want to be.
There should be some choice in it, and I think that's a thing we haven't looked at. But there should be some choice about the interactions in whatever way I choose to have them, whether it is to sit across from you and share a cup of coffee or drink in the local disco or whatever, that there has to be some kind of agreed consent. This drink means a drink.
Well, I have to say that kind of depresses me. I mean, I know it, but it's another thing to sort of see it there and to look at the time frame and realize we're back in this conversation. Has the environment shifted now for good? Or will we be here 50 years from now showing a clip from this show and saying it still goes on?
It's the cynic in me wants to say that it will probably be back here again. Because similarly, I remember watching the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings and thinking all the conversation afterwards about how this is going to shift the culture and people are going to come out more. Of course, it didn't help that he still ended up being appointed, but there was real hope that was going to change the context of this, and it didn't, right? So the cynic in me is worried that after all of this conversation, it's going to go back. I mean, I think there's definitely been some progress since then culturally, but we have a long way to go, and I think it's just going to kind of keep cycling.
Well, one of the things that keeps coming up as these discussions have been happening more and more as more folks have come forward you mentioned training for employers. Lots of folks have mentioned training in the workplace because we're talking about sexual harassment, unwanted attention, advances in the workplace. But NPR just reminded us that a report a year ago by the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, said they were pretty down on training. That training had, in the last 3 decades, speaking of time passing, had not proven to be successful or effective. That companies engage in it as a way to sort of check the box, but that's it. But all of you are doing some training at some level, and you've seen it be effective. So I'd love you to respond to that. Where are we if we can't train or as a result of people being aware that it's happening?
I think it's not happening frequently enough, that institutions are generally sort of check the box to be able to say that we had some introduction, some exposure, I think, to kind of knowing what behaviors are appropriate and not appropriate. But it really takes consistent and regular training for the institution, for the people who work within the institution, but also each of us individually have to sort of consistently be educating ourselves and even if we think we've arrived at sort of being able to know about gender inequality, that we have to continue to keep teaching ourselves and keep learning.
And that training is part of a comprehensive approach, not by itself, because then it becomes a checkbox. It's policy change, legislative action, training, right? It's these multiple strategies, whether it's systems, institutions, or in communities. It can't be just one thing. In order to make the change, it has to be multiple strategies.
It has to be quality training. You know, a lot of those
well,
trainings
come on
are
now.
like
Good point.
some
Yeah,
old video from the 80s. Of, you know,
That's right.
You know, a lot of the work that I do focuses on bystander intervention training. And that's really about changing, you know, that culture around a perpetrator so that people step up and say something and stop that person from what they're doing, versus a lot of times the focus of those types of, you know, workplace trainings is, you know, if you're a potential perpetrator, here's what not to do. And that's not, you know, perpetrators aren't listening to that. So it's all those elements need to be in place, and people around them need to interfere when they see something happening.
Right. I want to go back to, can I just go back to what you said about the race dynamic and whether this will end? Because I believe that until we see sexual violence, sexual assault as a tool of oppression and get at the root causes of who's being oppressed in our society, in our cultures, and really join behind those voices that are at the margins, this will never change.
That's the extension of the power dynamic that we're talking about.
That's right.
And I'm curious from you, is that are companies scared now? Are they stepping up because of this atmosphere so that they don't have to look at you soon as an employment litigation person saying, hey, this is we're at this formal complaint stage now because you didn't do what you were supposed to do?
I think that, you know, the uptick in conversation about this in the media is different from, you know, what employers are experiencing on the day-to-day. Because, you know, I wish I could say that sexual harassment does not occur in any workplace, but that's just not the case. And employers have been dealing with it for many years and will continue to for, I think, a number of reasons, including that no matter how good your intentions are, occasionally people behave in ways that are unpredictable and can't be easily explained. But I do believe that, again, there is an increased focus on confirming that the steps that have been taken in the workplace are adequate, and also making sure that the positions that employers have taken with respect to remediating the conduct are the best approaches, and just working with counsel to make sure that there are no steps or options that they hadn't considered that might be effective given the particular complainant at issue. So I imagine there is a bit of fear there, but also just recognition that employers, or at least in my case, the clients that we work with, have been working at this and will continue to do so.
I'm just noting that a lot of these companies where these men have been outed recently have not covered themselves in glory as we peel back and see how much cover-up was going on instead of working toward trying to address the problem as you suggest, they were busily using all kinds of tools at their disposal because they liked the person, because it was a power broker, because we've just said this is a power issue. So I'm hoping, or looking at you thinking, will that fear translate where they say, we don't want to spend millions of dollars covering up for power broker X?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's about taking responsibility for what's happening in the workplace. And I think what Duane just pointed out, I mean, it's a collective responsibility. And not only, the actors, but the people who are standing around and watching these things happen. It's important to come forward. And, I understand, given my line of work, that it's not easy to do that. A lot of people are afraid of retaliation, and there are real consequences in certain circumstances. It's tough to stand up as an employee and face, the highest ranked person in your company, if that happens to be the actor. And the employee has to make a decision.
I want to put a pause right there because we're going to pick this up in just a few minutes, but you're right. That's the end of this show. We thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us. Stay with us right now, though, because you want to hear the end of what Carla has to say as we continue our conversation about the sexual harassment online at Facebook Live.